All right. Again, good morning, everyone. My name is Anthony Markham. I'm a resident fellow at the R Street Institute. And thank you for joining us for this morning's event titled Scrutinizing the Role of Expertise in Scientific Evidence in the Legal and Regulatory Arenas. And when it comes to difficult science questions, both the legal and regulatory realms have similar challenges. For instance, when considering new science-based regulations, regulators are typically faced with imperfect information and have to rely on past practices to weigh potentially conflicting information to establish useful rules and regulations. Likewise, in the courtroom, trial judges are frequently tasked with weighing scientific evidence to determine what will be presented at trial, often with little outside assistance. And they aren't alone. Lawmakers, too, come from a variety of backgrounds and have similar challenges in assessing complicated science questions and formulating policies based on outside expert advice and testimonies. This event is going to discuss the importance of incorporating high quality science in both the policymaking and legal realms. And I want to begin by giving you a short roadmap of today's event. We're going to have two panel discussions. The first is going to begin shortly at 10:30. The second will start about an hour later at 11:30. Each panel will run for about an hour and will include a moderated panel discussion as well as a question and answer session at the end of those panel events. The first panel will concern the role of science in regulation. Devin Hartman, the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy here at the R Street Institute, will lead a panel discussion on that topic. After that, I'll be leading a second panel discussion on scientific evidence in the courtroom. But before those panels begin, we do have an opening address from Congressman Peter Meyer from Michigan's 3rd Congressional District. Congressman Meyer will discuss his perspectives as a member of Congress facing a variety of science-based challenges and his work on the House Space Science and Technology Committee. As a brief background, Congressman Meyer is a 4th-generation West Michigander, born and raised in Grand Rapids. He previously enlisted in the Army Reserves and deployed to Iraq as a non-commissioned officer. After that, he attended Columbia University and joined an NGO in Afghanistan. He eventually returned to Michigan to work in urban redevelopment and real estate and was sworn in as a congressman from Michigan's 3rd District in January 2021. In the House today, he serves on the Committee of Homeland Security as ranking member on the Subcommittee on Oversight, Management, and Accountability. He also serves on the Committee on Foreign Affairs and the Space Science and Technology Committee. So with that, I'll begin a message by Congressman Meyer.
Hey everybody, my name is Peter Meyer and I represent Michigan's 3rd Congressional District in the House of Representatives. I was sworn into office in January of this year and I serve on 3 committees: Foreign Affairs, Homeland Security, and Science, Space, and Technology. And I really appreciate you guys for having me and having me as a guest today to be able to speak with this group about this important topic. So members of Congress come in with many different backgrounds and experiences, and we often face complicated policy challenges concerning complex science issues. We've had some recent successes on the House Science Committee, such as the passage of a measure to improve the American Supply Chain Database and a bill to modernize the Department of Energy's research activities. But a pressing question, and one that I know I have a lot of questions around, is how can policymakers who work on science issues do so more successfully across the board? One issue here that needs serious attention, and this is where understanding those empirical metrics and having a research-based foundation is critical, comes around Pfas contamination. I'm a member of the bipartisan Pfas task force, and we're experiencing firsthand the challenge of crafting legislation to address and regulate Pfas contamination. If you're not familiar, Pfas is a chemical substance that has a wide variety of uses, from waterproofing to fire retardant capabilities. But this Pfas chemical, when it is used, can get into groundwater and it lasts for a very long time. There are strong concerns about the carcinogenic characteristics of this forever chemical, and we've had many instances of groundwater contamination in West Michigan in particular, and in Michigan in general, around this chemical. Now, we're finding it in Michigan because we're looking for it, but it is a nationwide issue. But one of the challenges is, we have some standards at the state level that go as low as 7 parts per trillion, and others that go up to 70 parts per trillion. So you have an order of magnitude difference at that state regulatory level. And the ultimate question that we ask is, where is this most appropriate? We need to make sure that from the state to the federal regulation side, this is sensible and it's based on sound policy, so we can both ensure that cleanup is being done in the areas that need it most, and also make sure that there are not those long-lasting negative health implications. If you have too low of a standard, you end up looking for a needle in the haystack. You do not prioritize well what areas actually need it, and you don't allocate resources accordingly. If you have too high a standard, you could potentially be allowing for conditions that are putting individuals in an unsafe space. So it's really key on both the remediation and on the drinking water side when it comes to PFAS that we have good science, we have accurate science. We're not taking a risk-averse approach, but we also aren't taking an overly risky approach, that we strike that fine balance and leverage resources. Generally speaking, on environmental issues, both Democrats and Republicans need to make serious improvements in our messaging around this issue. We should not claim that the world is going to end tomorrow if we don't tackle climate change and greenhouse gases. But we also can't deny the reality of that problem. I think both sides have gotten baked in where they see the environment as a Trojan horse that they can use to either leverage their own policy priorities, or on the Democratic side, or try to just deny that reality and continue to support traditional constituencies. So our discussion of PFAS and other environmental topics has to be based on science, on some research, on empirical data, rather than on nuance and supposition and innuendo, so that we can appeal not only to the American people, but also not just have this be an issue that focuses and relies on political appeal, but again, it's just viewed as something that's common sense, that's pragmatic, and that it strikes the right balance. And on that front, we've certainly had more than a handful of challenges around deciding the best course of action on creating an operating hypothesis around the coronavirus pandemic. If you remember the very early days, the CDC, or I should say the Surgeon General, was imploring people, don't wear masks, masks don't help, because our understanding was very different on aerosolized transmission. Everyone was passing out hand sanitizer. We were elbow bumping because we were afraid of shaking hands. Meanwhile, we're getting in close and talking to each other and laughing while elbow bumping, right? I mean, it's just, people were putting their mail in their microwaves. I mean, they were leaving groceries out and putting bleach on your fruits and vegetables. I mean, just insane responses now that were tailored to what we understood or assumed about the pandemic and about coronavirus transmission very early on. All the more key to be able to have that accurate understanding, because this is one of those problems. Is those cultural components get baked in early on, way ahead of where the proven science is. It's more, we have an operating hypothesis, but the whole point of an operating hypothesis is it's dependent on assumptions that are dependent on variables that by their very nature change. And what you need to do is you need to understand what assumptions were made and never forget those, because when those underlying assumptions alter, you need to alter that course. There was a reason why we shifted to mask wearing. There was a reason why, the part of the lockdown and mask hypothesis was in order to give us that pause, to give us that delay until the vaccine came online. Now we have that vaccine, but we're not seeing the shift and other government regulatory approaches. So I think it's key that we not only continue to focus on having everything be based on the latest and the best science, to not, catastrophize. We had a small sample around a very, unique and insular community in, I believe it was Rhode Island, that had seen spikes around the Delta variant. Now, obviously the Delta variant is concerning, but again, there's a risk when we over extrapolate, and there's also a risk when we under extrapolate. There's a risk when we go too far forward on assumptions, and there's a risk when we don't change what we're doing, even as those underlying characteristics change. So I hope that we can address this through greater STEM support, through having more of our American students trained in the scientific method, trained in understanding the value of that approach that epistemological framework to understanding how the world's constructed, to having approaches based on science, based on something that can be peer reviewed, that can be replicated, that can be checked, while at the same time holding an appreciation that there are other things that exist outside, that we can't control for every assumption, that we can't collect unlimited data, that there are some components that fit outside the narrative cookie cutter, the dough that's left around the side, is a part as well. And so we need to have some grace, we need to have some flexibility. We need to both have the hard data, but that also, operate off of prevailing assumptions and that are checked, that are re-examined, and that are remembered. I'm certainly a believer that we have a use for some regulation. There should be limits on pollution. There should be ways in which negative externalities can be accounted for, through a governing framework. But when that governing framework is not merely to check the negative externalities, is not to work towards some Benthian, common good, what we end up doing is empowering the government to be a lever. I think this is the danger of an overly regulatory state. I know something near and dear to our street that oftentimes gets in here is around occupational licensing, and what that does when it's not merely to ensure a degree of consistency, standardization, and public safety, but again, a mechanism that the government can use for rent seeking, a mechanism that entrenched industries can use in order to protect themselves from competition in ways that have no bearing on safety, have no bearing on consumer well-being. So I think at the core, we need to have a common set of facts in order to be on the same page, in order to be able to have constructive disagreement, in order to hopefully learn from those disagreements and achieve a desired course of outcome. But in order to do that, you have to have that shared set of facts. And nowhere is that more key than in areas pertaining to science and technology, pertaining to research, pertaining to that research method, and having, again, not innuendo, not conjecture, not anything that doesn't hold up to rigorous scrutiny being the basis, but getting that shared reality, those shared sets of facts, so we can move forward together and have policies that are smart, that are tailored, that are sensible, but that can also be adjusted if the data changes. So I really want to thank everyone for inviting me today. I'm sure this is going to be an incredibly insightful discussion. And so I really appreciate having a few minutes to share my thoughts.
All right, and then so after that message, now we'll start with our very first panel of the day. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Devin Hartman, and he'll begin our first panel on regulatory issues and dealing with this topic. So Devin.
Thank you, Anthony, and good morning to our audience. We're very excited to dig into this topic. I think the Congressman did a nice job of outlining sort of the salience of this issue. That is broadly defined the role of science in public policy decision-making. And I think over the last year and a half, suffice to say that our public discourse has really picked up on this theme more broadly, but also as it relates really to the regulatory arena, which is going to be the focus of the first panel here. We saw a particularly contrasting approach between the last two administrations when it comes to understanding scientific quality, variances in scientific quality, and how that translates into regulatory decision-making. So we've put together a panel of 3 experts today that are really going to help us sort of dissect some of these issues in greater depth, especially for institutions like the Food and Drug Administration and the Environmental Protection Agency. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to make a note that our street does have a policy that encourages diverse representation on our panels. Unfortunately, today, our 4th panelist could not make it at the last minute, and it proved very difficult to find a replacement for her. But nevertheless, we do think that we have a nice range of perspectives spanning multiple administrations in the past here on our panel today. And before I do introductions, I'd like to just make sure everyone understands, for sort of run of show purposes, that we're thinking about a 45-minute or so structured conversation for our panel, and then about 15 minutes for Q&A. And then after that, we'll go over to Anthony to discuss the legal framework of these issues. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our first panelist, Richard Williams. Richard is a senior affiliated scholar at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where he has 9 years of experience as the vice president for policy. He served for 27 years at FDA as the chief social scientist for the Center for Food Safety and Nutrition, and recently served on EPA's Science Advisory Board. Richard is the current chairman of the board for the Center for Truth and Science and on the board of the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences. He's also the author of a forthcoming book, Fixing Food, an FDA Insider Unravels the Myths and Solutions. With a title like that, Richard, I can't wait to block off a couple weekends here to dig in. Next up will be Tony Cox. Tony is a clinical professor at the University of Colorado. He's also president of Cox Associates, which is an applied research company specializing in quantitative risk analysis, causal modeling, advanced analytics, and operations research. Tony was inducted into the National Academy of Engineering, and he's a member of the National Academy's Board on Mathematical Sciences and their applications. He has also served as chair of EPA's Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, which we'll certainly be discussing here in a couple minutes. And last, but certainly not least, we have Jonathan Weiner. Jonathan is a professor of law, environmental policy, and public policy at 3 separate schools, but all at Duke University. He's the co-director of the Duke Center on Risk and the Science and Society Initiative, and he's also served as president of the Society for Risk Analysis and co-directed the Rethinking Regulation program at Duke University. Before going to Duke, he serves at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and at the U.S. Department of Justice in both the first Bush and Clinton administrations. So welcome to our panelists. And without delay, let's just jump right into this. I'm going to start off with a question for Richard right out of the gate here. Richard, if you don't mind sort of taking the broad approach to start, and then we'll get into more specific conversation here in a bit. What are the challenges today of using science to craft federal regulations?
Yeah, thank you, Devin. And excuse me, thank you for inviting me. I think there's a perfect storm with respect to the use of science in regulatory agencies. And that is, we're getting poor sciences from the academy, excuse me, poor incentives for regulatory agencies to use good science, and poor oversight from Congress and the executive branch. So let me start with science. In the academy right now, there are incentives to produce actually publish only positive results and to try to get bigger results. And that's so that academics can get tenure and more funding. On the journal side, they're also interested only in positive results and sort of big findings. And that produces bias sciences. As a result of this, the former editors of Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine said they don't believe half of what they read, of the science that they read in journals. Then we come to the problem of regulators. And regulators really, in order to regulate, and that's what they do, they regulate, they really only need an anecdote to justify what they're doing, but they can also only use correlations rather than causation, which I'm sure we'll get into, or just cherry pick the science. But even if they didn't do all that, they're overwhelmed by the science. So let's just take an example, glyphosate, which has been in the news recently. Suppose you wanted to regulate glyphosate. If you go on to Google Scholar and look at the number of papers, you come up with just short of 300,000 papers. How are regulatory agencies supposed to separate out what's good and what's bad? It's quite difficult. For analysts, the problem is they have to sort of go along with what the agencies want to do. They're required to support what the agencies do. In fact, this problem goes back to 1981, where the Office of Management and Budget, or excuse me, the Office of Personnel Management noted that this was a problem with analysts, and they put out some guidelines that said that analysts should provide comprehensive, balanced information and analysis to all sides of policy issues, rather than by advancing the ideas of a single decision maker, philosophy, or point of view. Unfortunately, that's been lost in the agencies now. And then finally, we get to the problem with oversight. So Congress has not shown a great deal of interest in the use of science in regulatory agencies, but even more, they haven't shown much of an interest in whether or not agencies accomplish anything. So if you don't have causation, if you only have correlation, a lot of what you're going to do is not going to result in positive health results. For example, agencies are required and have been required for years by Congress to produce reports under the Government Performance Results Act. Congress has ignored this when funding agencies. They've had numerous opportunities to allow stakeholders to challenge the agencies on the use of science, and this could have been in the Regulatory Accountability Act, or now in the Information Quality Act, simply amending that to allow stakeholders to challenge it. That hasn't been done. So I sort of contend that right now we're in a state of a perfect storm where we have, in some cases, poor science coming to the agencies. The agencies don't have incentives to find good science, and even if they wanted to, it's quite difficult. And we don't get the kind of oversight from either Congress or the public that we need. And finally, there's the executive branch and OMB, and they simply don't have the horses to provide this kind of oversight. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Richard. And that certainly gives us plenty of food for thought here, no pun intended, on some of the challenges ahead. Sort of building off of that sort of current state of affairs perspective, I'd like to maybe turn this over to Tony and then Jonathan to really answer the same question here, which is, what have you observed as sort of the role of science in regulatory matters and how it's evolved in the last couple of decades? And in particular, do we have a sense over this time frame about how much improvement in, say, public health, safety, environmental quality, and other benefits of these targeted regulatory processes? How much of that is roughly attributable to regulatory intervention versus sort of non-governmental factors? Tony, let's start with you.
Well, great questions, and thanks. And I think they're tightly connected questions. I share much of Richard's perspective. It seems to me that what many people mean by science has changed a lot over the last 20 years. So think to yourself, what do you mean by science? What do you mean by good science or by sound science? To me, the essence of science is testing our beliefs against data and sort of learning from the world whether what we think is true is actually true. So science is largely about testable and falsifiable predictions. It seems to me that over the last 20 years, and especially since around 2008, I'm taking a point of view informed partly by developments at the EPA and an approach to weight of evidence. Respect for consensus and for the formation of consensus opinions has increased, and the concept of consensus has acquired a lot of weight. The concept of empirically independently verifiable truths and demonstrable predictive power. Do our beliefs that reducing an exposure will lead to better health, do those beliefs turn out to be true when we look at the data? It seems to me that concept of science has largely faded away. It's been replaced by, is this what our best judgment tells us we should expect, rather than, is this what the data shows happens? So I think there are definitely some researchers and observers who are trying to reverse this trend. I have the pleasure of serving on a board that advises a group called the Center for Truth and Science. Well, the fact that a Center for Truth and Science is needed, or that many people think that it's needed, with a mission of restoring and expanding the use of objective, empirically verifiable science, I think speaks to the extent to which at least some people feel hungry for getting back not to opinion and not to consensus, but to the kind of science that can be independently verified. But I think that this is fairly countercultural at the moment. I think that many prominent researchers now consider calls for quantitative tests of the predictive accuracy of their beliefs and their policy relevant convictions and advice to be dangerous and misguided, and not just the ordinary requirement for any form of sound science that it used to be 20 or 30 years ago. Increasingly, untested assumptions, at least in my observation, and assumption-driven, to reflect some of the Congressman's thoughts, assumption-driven computer models with no known predictive validity, such as EPA's Ben map and many others that have not been predictively validated, are used to justify regulations by spinning out or projecting hypothetical consequences of different regulatory actions and then saying, okay, take the one that looks best according to the model. But the models are not well validated. They don't correspond to sort of a classical concept of predictively valid truth producing mechanisms. So this is often called science, and definitely people working on these models think of themselves as scientists, but it's lost contact, I think, with the essence of sound science, which is testing whether predictions are true. So what's to be done? I think this move from science as independently verifiable truth and valid predictive generalizations, from that old-fashioned concept to science as consensus assumptions that can be implemented in a model, I think it's very well illustrated by how risk is attributed to factors such as pollutants or COVID or smoke in the West. Attributing a certain number of deaths per year to some factor, if you think about it, doesn't actually make any testable predictions. There's no falsifiable prediction. If I say 10 million deaths per year are due to people drinking apple juice or being exposed to asbestos or whatever, I haven't actually made a predictive claim that can be shown to be wrong. I've simply said, here's how much blame I'm going to assign to this. That's a real departure and a real loss from science. So to wrap up, really on both your questions, I think that we don't have a good sense of what the actual effects of interventions have been. There have been studies, so-called accountability studies or intervention studies, that try to quantify how much difference did our interventions make. And generally, they've come back saying it's really hard to tell. We're not actually seeing a lot of readily verifiable difference. Again, I'm speaking now specifically of air pollution regulations, but I think the concept goes more generally that intervention studies are relatively rare compared to association and attribution studies, and they don't tell a very clear story. I think there's a huge opportunity for us to do better by returning to what I think of as old-fashioned science, which some people view as a dangerous innovation. But I think testing our beliefs against data, never have we been able to do this better than we can do it now. The technical tools in epidemiology and computational toxicology and other sciences are shiny and sharp and ready for use. And I think that, to channel Richard, pretty much people are wandering in a desert right now where they are looking to consensus opinions. They don't know whether the consensus opinions or judgments are accurate. And when asked, what does this judgment, for example, this causal determination judgment, even mean? Are you talking about necessary causation, sufficient causation, contributing causation? The answer is nobody knows. So I think it's possible to do better, and I look forward to seeing us do better, and maybe even helping out a little bit for us to bring that state of affairs about.
Thank you, Tony. And there's so much to unpack within that, and I think we'll be able to do that in some of the subsequent questions here. I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan to answer the same sort of overarching question, but Jonathan, feel free to also respond to any of the views that either Richard or Tony expressed as well. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Devin. Thanks for having me on the panel, and it's great to see also my colleagues Richard and Tony from Society for Risk Analysis, where we've known each other for many years. And I also appreciated the introductory remarks by Representative Meyer on the challenge of making good decisions in the face of complex problems. So there's a lot to address here, but let me start by saying there are aspects on which I very much agree with what Richard and Tony have said, and Representative Meyer, which is that we need expertise and good science in regulation. not primarily because the objective is truth, but because the objective is improving social outcomes. And the problems that we face are complex in energy, environment, climate change, public health, national security, and space exploration. I noted the committees on which Representative Meyer serves. Those all pose complex and interesting questions, and they don't admit of easy or simple answers. We need to inquire. And so the spirit of scientific inquiry is crucial for addressing these large problems. The United States, in historical perspective and in global perspective, compared to other countries and over time, actually, my view is the United States has built a very strong, and compared to many other countries, much more attentive approach to science in regulatory decision-making. And I base that partly on having published several articles in a book on comparing US regulation to other countries, and also on the history of the role of science in administrative agency decision-making. Every presidency of the last 40, 50 years has had an executive order calling for evidence-based regulation, including several of those executive orders calling for retrospective review to see how policies actually worked. But I'll come back to that point and how well we've done or not done on retrospective review. And since 1946, the Administrative Procedure Act has required that agencies take actions that are not arbitrary and capricious and that are based on substantial evidence. And that's filtered its way through numerous court decisions where judicial review of agency science has, I think, in some ways become increasingly attuned to the kinds of causation questions that that Tony was just mentioning. In addition, several statutes have in them specific provisions for agencies to rely on the best available science or the latest science. And that has, I think, one can point to a number of court decisions where courts have become more attentive to reviewing agency science and holding the agency to the best available science criteria, although I think we could do better on that. But I'm thinking of decisions by the US Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit in 2000 on chloroform, telling EPA it had to look to its own best science. In 2009 on fine particulate matter air pollution, and a Ninth Circuit decision in 2015 on pesticides. Those are just some examples of courts telling agencies you needed to do better to adhere to the best available science criterion. So that all that said, and I have more to say about retrospective review and how we learn over time, which we'll come back to, but I just want to finish this part of our conversation by saying the role of science and expertise in regulatory policymaking, while essential, as I've said, also needs to be focused on the objective of improving social outcomes. So the difference between the science and the policy, or between risk assessment and risk management, is a difference between an is and an ought. And the is by itself is perhaps necessary but not sufficient to make good decisions. And the question of the is, the science or the risk assessment for policymaking, is not really a question of definitive truth or definitive proof of truth. It's whether the social outcomes are improving, which we then need to keep studying and updating. And so we need to take more of a benefit cost or value of information approach to the science rather than a kind of categorical criteria for valid or invalid.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's really insightful. And in fact, the question after the next one I have planned, we'll dig into some of those cost and benefit considerations, because I think we can all say perhaps on the more normative side of this, a big thing going forward is to try to sort of maximize social welfare, and sort of maximizing benefits less costs is integral to that. But before we get to that question, I wanted to actually touch on some themes that Richard and Tony raised, and that is whether you're talking about the difference between correlation and causation, or we're talking, for example, you're all risk professionals. And a lot of times the popular discourse believes that science gives us black and white answers, right? X causes Y. We know exactly what the magnitude of that effect is. But a lot of times what we find, especially with, potential carcinogens versus known carcinogens, and even known ones, for example, a lot of times we don't know, or we have a big uncertainty band on what the magnitude of the effect is. And of course, science is an evolving process, right? So one thing that regulators find themselves in is having to make decisions with imperfect information. And then of course, that information changes over time. So naturally, a big question for the quality of our regulatory institutions is how well regulatory processes account for imperfect information, and how well these processes age over time as new information becomes available. I'll start again in the same order with Richard for that question. Thanks.
So it's interesting. From my time in government, I found that one of the things that was not appreciated was uncertainty. If you present to a decision maker and you talk about uncertainty, they tend to shy away. In some cases, the attorneys in the regulatory agencies say, don't talk about uncertainty in your analysis because that weakens our case. And as you know, most major regulations, or a large percentage of them, end up in court. Managers, I'll just give you an example of one where a commissioner was briefed on methylmercury, and he was given a dose response curve and said, well, at certain levels, here's what's going to happen. At higher levels, here's what's going to happen. And it was a really good presentation and contained a lot of uncertainty. And at the end, he said, okay, all that's fine. Give me a number that I can use. And that's the number where it's either safe or unsafe. And that's what he wanted. And I heard that over and over again. Secretary of HHS, Donna Shalala, came over, and that was the first time that had happened. And she made a big speech to FDA, and she was talking about food. She said, well, for me, food is either safe or it's unsafe. And we get it. She wasn't a risk scientist, but that's a lot of what goes on in agencies. Uncertainty is not necessarily a welcome thing.
Yeah, and that makes it very difficult because science has almost inherent uncertainty built into it, and it can a lot of times lead to concepts like we hear like probability neglect, right? Where a lot of folks presume a type of effect rather than, and just kind of disregard the underlying probability of that effect. Tony, what thoughts do you have on this concept of imperfect information and regulatory process?
Yeah, well, first, it's directly related to what Jonathan mentioned. There are good tools within risk analysis and decision analysis, including value of information. They start with the concept that evidence is typically quantitative, not qualitative. And actually, one of my big concerns, big beefs with the way things have been done since around 2008 at EPA, is that evidence there is regarded as categorical. We label things as causal or is likely to be causal, or in other categorical terms. But underneath that, what we're really looking at is conditional probabilities of conclusions given data and knowledge, and in some cases assumptions. What I've seen is that regulatory processes right now are really lousy at saying, I don't know. And we saw this we've all seen this somewhat in the last year with COVID. The concept of saying, we don't know, there's a lot of uncertainty, is not something that comes easily to many regulatory processes. What do we do instead? Instead of saying, I don't know, we say our best guess or our best assumption, our best set of assumptions is the following. How do we know they're the best? Because we've really worked hard on this and we've talked it over and kicked it around and tried to come up with the best set of assumptions. What that leaves on the table is this idea that, again, uncertainty is quantitative. It's not qualitative. It doesn't matter if something is your best assumption set or your best guess if it's very uncertain. It has been said many times that science has a self-corrective aspect, that although we may not know right now how things work, and we may get some things wrong, over time, those errors will be revealed. But the world we live in now has a deep connection. Science and university research are intimately entwined with the news cycle and with what gets reported. And indeed, many half-baked and not ready for prime time assertions are made to the media. There's a paper from a couple of years ago that found that more than half of pronouncements about risk effects are later found to be mistaken. And the authors of that paper said, and I quote, that whereas 234 newspaper articles covered the 35 initial studies that were later confirmed, so big press for the original findings, only 4 press articles covered a subsequent null finding and mentioned the refutation of an initial claim. So what I'm going to suggest is that uncertainty can be dealt with better by first recognizing that it should be quantitative, not categorical. Secondly, by recognizing that what's reported and what people notice and what policymakers continue to use, right now in Ireland, it is still being said that banning smoky coal saves some number of lives per year. It's been known since 2013 that the empirical basis for that statement is incorrect. It came from confusing the fact that death rates are going down over time and pollution has gone down over time, confusing that with the causal statement that one of those things caused the other. Turns out it's not true. Policymakers and newspapers are still carrying that story. So I think there's an illusion of certainty. There's a constant illusion that we know more than we do. And I think being better at quantifying our uncertainty, and as Jonathan said, looking at the value of new information, which is high when you're uncertain, it's low when you're not uncertain, saying there's a lot of value to finding out more. How are we going to do it? I think that's a very good direction to go in.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Yeah, you raised a lot of like really great one-liners, I think, in that. It reminded me of when I did some work in the past with EPA's air cost, benefit, and risk assessment teams, where your point on quantifying uncertainty comes into play, because a lot of the refrain that we would hear from staff at that time was, how can we quantify, like what is quantifiable in this domain? And then how do we make sure what's measurable doesn't swamp what's meaningful? And that kind of raised a series of decision-making criteria of qualitative versus quantitative trade-offs. So rolling over this uncertainty theme and how regulatory institutions respond, one principle that came up a lot is the sort of a precautionary approach of a lot of regulatory bodies. And so with that kind of spirit, I want to turn over to Jonathan, who's actually done some research on that concept, but also generally, Jonathan, I'd be curious in response to the prior to and the role of regulatory process with imperfect information.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, first, a comment on uncertainty and then on precaution and learning. So on uncertainty, I think I agree with the spirit of what both Richard and Tony said, that we need to be comfortable with uncertainty. We need to be able to talk about uncertainty. And that's true not only in ordinary discourse and in the news media, but in regulatory decisions and in judicial review of regulatory decisions. In my experience working in government, it was a little different from Richard's. Yes, I heard some policymakers and political appointees in, by the way, administrations of both political parties say that they wanted a single number, a point estimate, or that they didn't want to hear about the uncertainty. More rare to hear that. But I actually heard quite a lot of discussion of uncertainty. And in the offices where I worked, notably at the Office of Science, Technology Policy and the Council of Economic Advisors, people very comfortable with talking about uncertainty. I also think that being forthright about uncertainty can strengthen an agency's presentation to the public and to a reviewing court. Because these are repeat relationships. And if an agency comes to be viewed as stating with purported certainty that it knows the answer, or that there is no harm, or there is extreme harm, and then it turns out that scientific understanding evolves over time, the agency will look less credible. So agencies that come to court with a more nuanced and a more forthright depiction of uncertainty may actually be on stronger grounds. I mean, that's at least a hypothesis that we could test by looking at judicial review. And that's also a point about consistency across agency decisions, so that they should take an even-handed approach to certainty and uncertainty, or to the inevitable uncertainty across multiple decisions. The point that there's an article coming out by Richard Revesz at NYU, talking about how courts should look more to consistency across agency decisions in the NYU Environmental Law Journal. Now, that said, the essence of risk is that we don't know the future. And so we're always going to face uncertainty. And I agree with Tony that we can't have and can and should develop better tools to quantify that uncertainty and incorporate it in policymaking. That said, taking account of uncertainty does not necessarily mean that does not necessarily point to inaction or waiting. It can, in important examples or circumstances, mean we should do more research, do more study to try to find out key relationships. But it can also mean that we take better account of the distribution of risk across scenarios, and that in some cases, the tail of the distribution, which might be very low probability, might be highly uncertain, but might have such large impacts, benefits or harms, that it strongly influences the policy. And so rather than focusing on the best estimate or a point estimate, as Richard was criticizing, we should be looking, I think, at robustness across distributions of probabilities and scenarios. Okay, that leads to precaution, as you asked, Devin. Precaution and learning. So I've written a number of articles critiquing narrow versions of the precautionary principle, which say that uncertainty should lead to action, or that even to no permits or no approvals until the proponent shows that the substance or activity is, quote, safe or poses no risk. And I've criticized those because they're narrowly focused on a single target risk, and they don't take into account the risks that would be generated by the precautionary measure itself. For example, the foregone benefits of the restricted activity, or the substitutes that might be introduced, new chemicals in replacement of past chemicals. And in my view, the solution to that is not paralysis. The solution is to take a more holistic approach that considers the multiple risks that we face. I have a paper in the journal Risk Analysis last December on learning to manage a multi-risk world, which is about this problem, that we need to look at the multi-risk effects. This goes back to a book that John Graham and I published 25 years ago called Risk versus Risk, saying agencies need to look at multi-risk impacts, not just one risk at a time. But that leads to the point about learning. And so when we learn over time, we should be looking not only at is the causal relationship well established between this pollutant and its harm, but also what are the outcomes of the policy, including on other risks, on ancillary impacts, co-benefits and countervailing harms. And that learning process, I think, could be much improved in the US federal regulatory system. So we've had executive orders asking for retrospective review, and some administrations that pushed for that, both Democratic and Republican, but not a lot of progress on actually widespread retrospective review and feeding that back into regulatory improvement. And in a series of articles and reports that my colleague Lori Benier at Duke and I have recently published, we've been advocating for a broader approach to retrospective review that's not just one rule at a time, but looking at multiple rules to learn how to improve the ex ante forecasts, just what Tony and Richard have been talking about, by looking at retrospective experience, at which methodologies are more accurate, and also at improving the policy designs by comparing across multiple policies, which you can't really get from just looking at one policy at a time. And then we just published a report for ACUS, the Administrative Conference of the United States, on periodic review. It turns out that something around 40 or more federal statutes call on agencies to periodically review or review every 5 years or 8 years or 10 years their policies, but that's only done really occasionally or episodically. And some agencies in some programs do a very good job of that, but a lot of agencies have not really been doing the periodic review. And this is a potential mechanism for learning over time about what's actually happening, how the past policy is actually influencing. Of course, there are methodological challenges there in defining the baseline of what would have happened otherwise to compare the counterfactual, to compare to the policy outcomes that we observe. But in that report on periodic review, we suggest some best practices for agencies that could improve their implementation of that learning process. And then the last point I'll just say is there's a relatively new statute, the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2019, which calls on agencies to develop evaluation plans, and OMB has been implementing that with a series of memoranda on learning agendas. So I'm interested and perhaps hopeful that the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act will improve on our learning process over time in federal agency rulemaking.
Thanks, Jonathan. And that really leads into sort of the last question I want to ask for you all, sort of in the interest of time, to make sure we have enough opportunity for our audience to weigh in. A couple of Jonathan's last points there, whether it's the importance of retrospective review or incorporating sort of almost a better learning culture into some of these institutions. I'd just like to leave an open-ended question for you all to say, what regulatory reforms would really be most helpful to ensure decisions are guided by the best available information? And if you could, maybe even emphasize a little bit more on recognizing the variances in quality of scientific research that inform costs, benefits, and risk. But really that broad overarching theme of what reforms for next steps would be most fruitful in this regard. I'll start with maybe Tony, and then go to Jonathan, and then end with Richard here. Tony?
All right. So I think my advice would be pretty succinct. I'd say the first reform should be to stop treating evidence of association as evidence of causality, especially when obvious confounders have not been controlled for. And we could have a long discussion about the extent to which that's a problem. I think it's a huge problem and a very demonstrable problem. Secondly, stop treating untested assumptions and unsupported causal interpretations. Stop treating those as scientific conclusions. So often I read papers that say, our data suggest that some intervention would be desirable. And then careful analysis of the paper shows it's not the data that suggests that at all. It's the assumptions that are applied to the data that suggest the conclusion. And we basically have assumptions masquerading as conclusions. And third and finally, focus on testable predictive statements and then test them and report the results. So where I'm going with this is there's a whole approach to attribution of risk to factors that is not testable. What would be better? Instead, attribute change in risk to interventions and study the effects of interventions. And I think that approach, which is challenging, but for which there is a technical literature, as I say, on accountability studies, done well, which can be done now, looking at what was the effect of our actions rather than how much blame for a bad outcome should we attribute to different factors, is a much more constructive approach. It ties in better with science because it's about testable predictions, and it ties in better with policy because it's about effects of changes. And it is different from the framework that is primarily, let's use our best judgments to attribute risk to causes, and then regulate based on that attributed risk, which doesn't have those advantages of making testable predictions or of really saying how well is what we're doing working. So those would be my 3 pieces of advice.
That's great. Thank you, Tony. Jonathan, your thoughts?
I certainly agree with Tony that good science to support or inform regulatory decisions needs to test confounding factors. So we need to take a kind of multivariate approach, not one correlation between one supposed causal or explanatory variable and one outcome, but look at, because the world is complicated, and look at multiple factors. And I think we have statistical tools to do that. Maybe there are data gaps in some cases that might indicate that we need to collect more data on exposure to multiple stressors, for example. And I'm interested in what the mechanisms are for agencies to have access to, or the scientists working with them to have access to the data to make those statistical analyses more powerful and more realistic. So I agree with that. At the same time, because risk is about uncertainty about the future, we cannot know with certainty. We can't. I don't think it would be a good idea, and I don't think Tony was suggesting that we should have a posture of waiting for definitive proof before taking action, because that would be too restrictive of the ability to make good policy decisions that, based on the kind of good analysis that Tony is describing, that would have good social outcomes. On the point about judgment, I think I'm interested in perhaps a later conversation over coffee, about what counts as good judgment. I would just note that the many of the federal statutes that Congress has enacted asking agencies to regulate risks use the word judgment. And actually, in my view, that's been an underemphasized term. For example, the Clean Air Act, Section 109, for setting national ambient air quality standards, says that EPA should set standards which, in the judgment of the administrator, are requisite to protect public health and welfare with an adequate margin of safety. And that word judgment, in litigation over that section that I just quoted, courts repeatedly held that EPA was not allowed to consider cost because it only referred to public health and welfare. But another possible interpretation is that the judgment of the administrator should take into account the consequences of the setting that standard. So, so perhaps the word judgment is more embracing basis for agencies to consider the full information base for their policies.
That's a great point, and that may always be another follow-up item, because there's certainly some statutory limitations on the consideration of costs and benefits for certain types of pollutants. And for the last word here, I'll punt it over to Richard for his final thoughts on what sort of next regulatory reforms would be most productive to improve decision-making in regulatory bodies.
Sure. I want to go back to my perfect storm. So starting with science, I think we can look at what the Center for Open Science in Charlottesville is doing, where and journalists are signing on to this, saying you have to publish your hypothesis, you have to publish your model, and after you're finished, you have to publish your data. That's going to make scientists a little less likely to p-hack and so forth. I also think what the Center for Truth in Science is doing, which is looking at causation, how do we get a probability of causation? Hopefully, if people pick that up and use it in meta-analysis, that means that the agencies are going to receive better science. Insofar as the agencies, I'll just go back to uncertainty. I got in a lot of trouble for letting a highly trained economist and risk assessor brief HHS, and he talked about the uncertainty in his analysis. And at the end, they said, if you're so uncertain, it means you haven't done your job. Go back and get certain and then come back and talk to us. I got in a lot of trouble because I didn't go with him to help with that. And then so far as oversight, again, I'd like to see Congress pass something that would allow stakeholders and interested parties to hold the agencies accountable for science, whether that's through the Regulatory Accountability Act or amending the Data Quality Act. And finally, I think there's an excellent thought about oversight, which is, and this comes from Philip K. Howard, who wrote in, Try Common Sense. He says, why don't, instead of writing millions and millions of little rules, we just set big goals out for agencies, and then we hold those agencies accountable for achieving those goals. So I think there's lots of good ideas out there, and that will get us better science, and we just need to start acting on some of them.
That's great, and I want to follow up actually, Richard, in the spirit of accountability, because I'm reviewing the sort of some of the Q&A here, and of course for our audience, please plug in any questions here. But to kind of string together a couple themes, there's a lot of questions about who funds you, and this is something that all institutions face. And certainly this is not just a question of sort of like the nuts and bolts of having objective research. It's also about public confidence in the process itself, right? And so I kind of wanted to maybe pivot away from sort of the nitty-gritty methodological conversation and talk more about like transparency and accountability, of which sort of the incentive structure of researchers and regulatory bodies comes into play too, of which funding streams can be one element, right? So I'd be curious what the panel's views would be of what elements or what opportunities are there to improve transparency, accountability, and really help enhance public trust in the scientific development process and its translation to regulatory decision making. Jonathan, if you're okay with it, I'll start with you and go to Richard and then Tony.
Sure. Well, to repeat just a little bit, I think actually forthright discussion of uncertainty would improve public trust. It may seem like in the first instance, there's a lot of pressure on a policymaker, and we certainly know many examples where a regulator had to go speak to a community group, and there's intense pressure to say we know the answer, or but over time, I think being more forthright about uncertainty would be helpful, because that agency is going to be back in front of the public over and over again, and also back in front of the executive branch reviewing bodies like OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and back in court. So I think being more forthright about uncertainty would be, over time, helps the agencies be more credible and also build more trust. I think the whipsawing from one side to another, or one extreme to another, may undermine trust. Again, that's kind of a hypothesis. Maybe we can test that empirically and see what the psychology of public perception of expression of uncertainty is. There's probably research on that already. A second point to make, and really this is more of a question, is if transparency means disclosing the raw data, which is a topic that I think was before some of the advisory bodies at EPA over the last few years, when Tony, for example, was chairing one of those bodies. If that means disclosing the raw data, so how does that, how do we weigh the trade-offs there between the improving the ability for other scientists to review and replicate studies using the same raw data, versus the potential downsides of breaching the confidentiality of study participants? Maybe those can be anonymized, so there's not a confidentiality problem. I don't know. And also the other potential downside of, at least in the short term, making large bodies of research ineligible for an agency to rely on, because in the past that research would not comply with the new transparency requirements. I think that's an interesting set of trade-offs to consider. By the way, on transparency of executive branch review of the benefits and costs of regulation, I think OIRA has over time made progress. Back in 1993, the Clinton executive order 12866 called for much more transparency in OIRA review of agency rules. And over time, OIRA has put more and more of that in public. And I think that's been a good thing.
Perfect. I'll go over to Richard next for any thoughts on this question.
Sure. I think one big problem is people are concerned about funding. And I think if you look back, you see that there's a lot of concern about industry funding. Are people that are funded by industry, are they funded to find specific results? And the answer certainly I know in Meyer in food is in the past, absolutely, and it was a problem. But then if you look at people who are funded by government, it's the exact same problem. If you don't find the answer, if you don't find a risk, for example, that your government agency wants, your odds of getting funding in the next round have gone way, way down. So a couple of years ago, it's only been 1 or 2 years ago, iFancy, that I'm on their board, funded a study, and they looked at what was the probability of bias based on funding source. And their finding was fascinating. If you have funding sources that come from both government and industry, your probability of bias goes way down. So it strikes me that's one great way where you can have this coalition funding, and that's what IFAN says. If you have this coalition who's funding the science, that ought to give people a great deal of confidence that the bias will be absent.
That's a fascinating point. And Tony, do you have any additional thoughts on this one?
Yeah, one is a question. Would you rather say what's true, or would you rather be believed? Suppose there's a trade-off between appearing to be trustworthy and being accurate. I think the question of what is trustworthy gets back to principles of rhetoric, to pathos and ethos and logos that have very little to do with science. I think whether science is perceived as being trustworthy depends on long-term cultural habits. I would like to believe that those of us engaged in applying science to policy questions will earn the trust and eventually have the trust of the public if we go back to testing our beliefs against data. So there's a certain integrity in old-fashioned science, which is that the source of authority is not the plausibility or the credentials or the likability of those engaged in it, but is based on the independent verifiability of the truth statements that are made. So there's been a lot of chat while we were chatting on a very old topic that I always find annoying. The topic is, if you're funded by fill in the blank, won't your conclusions reflect the preferences of fill in the blank? And I imagine that question being asked to a second grader trying to add the numbers from 1 to 3. And I think the question, who is your funding source? Who's your sponsor? Who's asking you for the answer, is altogether inappropriate for calculations that are supposed to be objective. And I believe that real science is based largely on objective calculations. Now, I welcome discussion with a sort of postmodern framework that says objective calculations aren't possible. There's always bias. You're always influenced by people who fund you. I think that does not need to be true. And it doesn't need to be true when we're talking about uncertainty. And I have colleagues whom I like and respect, who I think take a very different view of the matter. But my view is that objective analysis is possible and desirable, and we should get on with it. And then to fill in the details does require turning to the technical side of things and saying, how are you going to do it? One of the questions on chat was, there are important data gaps. What are you going to do? How do you deal with those? And there's a multitude of answers. You can use multiple imputation. You can use all kinds of conditioning, but they tend to be technical answers. This area runs deep. It's part of the DNA of modern risk analysis and decision analysis, and there's a lot to it. And the punchline is, we should be engaged in objective calculations and earn the trust that goes with that approach.
That's a great point, Tony. And actually, you took my thunder there. I thought the most productive question in the chat here that came up here recently was asking about those data gaps, which was really interesting. So perhaps that's a good one to even end on here. We only have 4 minutes, so if you all don't mind just taking sort of the 30 to 60 second quick response approach here. How can we improve regulatory processes to identify these data gaps that are going to have the most value? It's sort of like a feedback mechanism, if you will, right? What do regulators really need to know to do their jobs better? And then how do we motivate the research to fill those data gaps? Tony, if you don't mind, since you're already on a roll, I'll start with you on this one.
Okay, so I'll just say, first, there's a great deal of technical depth to answering that question with names like value of information calculations, drawing diagrams that show where can we connect the dots and what's missing. So there's a lot of helpful technical information there, but I think a very simple principle that stands above and apart from the technical details might be useful, and that is focus on the demonstrable consequences of actions. That should be what we're doing. When I chaired CASAC, I started by asking various people at EPA and in CASAC and in former CASACs what they meant by causality. And what I thought everybody would say is that in the context of regulation, the kind of causality we care about is the one where if you reduce exposure, then health risks go down. That's what's called manipulative or interventional causation. It turned out I was naive. There were a plethora of concepts of causality, including, does a molecule from this substance participate, or could it participate in a biological pathway that would lead to harm, even if removing that molecule would allow oxygen in the air to take its place? If so, that should be considered causation for purposes of regulation, even if it doesn't change the outcome. My mind was blown, but recognizing how little definition there is of key things, I would again urge the sort of pragmatic principle. Let's look at the effects of our actions. That's the philosophical position from which I think good science, good applied science, will flow.
That's fascinating, and an area that you almost thought was settled in the sort of the scientific process, at least in that applied context. You actually see that maybe like there are some data gaps or sort of like some philosophical underpinnings that could affect that.
Very much so.
In the interest of time, we have about one minute before I just wrap up and thank you all. But Richard, Jonathan, if you sort of have a quick soundbite you'd like to throw in on this one, I want to give you the opportunity. Richard?
So a quick soundbite is use ANPRs. That's an advance notice of proposed regulation instead of a regulation. If you have a regulation, everybody has to fall in line. An ANPR is when an agency is asking questions. They've already received all the science. Ask the questions, and that will help direct the regulation in a better direction. So more ANPRs.
Right.
And my quick reply is consider the regulatory process a learning process. So it's not just that we work hard to understand a problem and then regulate, make a decision, and that's it, but we're going to follow up. And so over time, we're going to look at the effects on outcomes, as Tony was saying, and consider how the intervention, the policy, regulation actually affected those outcomes. And that may also reveal data gaps about what we don't know very well about intervention or about confounding factors, other things that are changing in the world. So see it as a learning process, do more retrospective and periodic review to try to improve our learning and updating over time.
Great.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, Jonathan, Tony, Richard, thank you very much for your time today. I know that we could have had a week-long event on this one to really dive in, and I hope that we have the opportunity to work with you in the future to dive into some of these topics in greater depth. But thank you for your time today. This was a great conversation.
Thanks all. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Devin. Thank you.
With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Anthony.
All right, thank you, Devin. All right, so we're going to start with the second panel of the day. As the panelists for this one, you can go ahead and turn on your microphones and videos, and then we'll get started for our second panel. Great. And so again, good morning and thank you everyone for joining us. This is going to be our second and final panel of the day. Again, my name is Anthony Markham. I'm a resident fellow at the R Street Institute. I first just want to thank Devin and the first group of panelists quickly. I thought they did a great job discussing the role of science and regulation and how regulators and the challenge of assessing all this information and creating good policies applicable to a number of public policy fields. So this panel is going to pivot from regulators and administrative agencies to the courtroom, because there are similar challenges that exist in the legal world as well. Both the judicial and regulatory arenas have faced questions about managing and considering scientific evidence. Mass litigation, for instance, concerning a variety of substances have led to vast industry changes and billions of dollars in settlements. And sometimes even just the threat of multi-year litigation alone is enough to encourage settlements and changes in consumer choice. And this is not an issue that will be going away anytime soon. As numerous science and technology areas become more complex, increasingly specialized industry areas will continue to evolve and change. Yet with few exceptions, we know state and federal courts are typically courts of general jurisdiction. Similarly, state and federal judges are often generalists, so frequently having little experience with a certain legal issue or industry controversy, often before tasked with helping resolve it in litigation. In cases that would concern complex scientific evidence or expert testimony, trial judges are tasked with weighing the available evidence and determining what evidence will be presented at trial, often with very little outside existence or assistance beyond the parties before them. Just notably, and we'll discuss this more in our panel discussion today, the 1993 Supreme Court case, Dauber v. Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals, trial courts have a gatekeeping function to ensure both the relevance and reliability of scientific expert testimony. And this is a difficult challenge for any decision maker, let alone a legal generalist or someone working in a courtroom. So after all, good science is not necessarily the aspiration for litigants trying to win or make a certain point. So when these difficult questions are debated at trial, they're done to secure a legal victory and possibly monetary gain. So thoughtfully resolving difficult science questions, although even dispositive to a case, is going to be a challenge. And there are a number of debates surrounding these issues and potential bugs in things like multi-district litigation, court rules addressing evidence and procedure, and the so-called gatekeeping rule that trial judges have when considering expert evidence. And so to help us tackle some of these issues, we have a couple of great panelists with us today. The first is Tim Pratt. Tim is an attorney, speaker, and advisor. Previously, he was a national trial lawyer handling mass tort cases. While in private practice, he was named a leading national products liability lawyer by Chambers USA. Tim has taught at the National Institute for Trial Advocacy for many years and was a frequent speaker on legal topics, trial topics, or tactics, and litigation strategy. After that, he was general counsel and corporate secretary at Boston Scientific, a multinational medical device company. In 2013, he was recognized by the Legal 500 and named to the Corporate Counsel 100 list, which identifies the top most powerful corporate legal advisors in the United States. Next is Larry Ebner. Larry is the executive vice president and general counsel of the Atlantic Legal Foundation, where he is responsible for all aspects of the ALF's nationally renowned amicus curiae program, including monitoring the United States Supreme Court, Federal Court of Appeals, and state court cases for possible amicus participation reviews and requests and personally offering many of the ALF's briefs. Previously, he was a Washington, D.C.-based litigator and appellate practice leader at a national law firm, and later launched his own nationwide appellate litigation boutique that focuses on matters that involve the federal government on federal law, including tort litigation and issues concerning federally regulated or procured products or services. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining us this morning. Greatly appreciate it. And I kind of want to start with the rise of these types of cases, the rise of MDLs, class actions, mass tort litigation in our federal courts. This is really, comparatively looking at the history of our legal system, maybe a more recent phenomenon. You know, these are the kind of cases where we're relying on vast experts and discussions and topics you probably didn't hear in a courtroom 30 plus years ago. And when we're first thinking of these cases, maybe we thought originally of tobacco or asbestos, but that's really evolved to a number of products, a number of issues, a number of type of complicated cases. So to start, I wonder, and I can start with you, Tim, if you could help us set the groundwork here. How did this really get started? Kind of this these growth in cases and what has happened over the last couple of decades, this recent explosion, and how much of these cases take up really in the federal and state dockets.
Yeah. Thanks, Anthony. I hope you all can hear me. I retired from Boston Scientific 2 years ago. So what that means is, 2020 pandemic is a nice time to be retired. Number two, I used to have people sort of come around and set all this stuff up for me. So I'm on my own now. So I don't know if you're hearing me, but yell at me if you can.
You're perfectly
Okay. So let me start here. Let's take class actions out of the equation right now. They're kind of a different animal under Rule 23. Let's talk about MDLs. About 50 years ago, 20 USC 1407 was adopted. And the concept of 1407, which is the new MDL procedure at the time, was if you had a bunch of cases involving common questions of fact pending before different courts around the country, federal courts, a panel, judicial panel, could sort of put them all in front of one judge. It made really kind of lots of sense. I mean, there weren't that many cases. You didn't have 12 judges working on the same case. You could consolidate it. Plaintiffs liked it. They didn't have to duplicate efforts. Defendants liked it in the main because they didn't have to produce, the same witness 2 or 3 times, do discovery, repetitively. So early on, it was a pretty good idea. There weren't very many cases. And then things changed. Then what I call the mass tort revolution came about. Plaintiffs' lawyers begin to figure out that there's kind of an easy way to represent a client and make money, and that is to include that client into a mass tort matter where they don't have to do the work. Somebody else is going to do the work, and they get the benefit to the extent there's a settlement down the road, which there, of course, always is. Other things changed. TV solicitation ads. I mean, there was in 2019, $200 million was spent on television solicitation ads. So that changed things. That brought more cases to the fore. Third-party litigation funding, which is a $5 billion business, where they support particularly mass tort litigation in a somewhat sometimes pernicious way because they aren't on the pleadings. They have some control often, or at least implied control over what's going on, but you don't know who's behind the scenes. So in terms of numbers, back in the old days, it wasn't much. Back when I was actually doing MDLs in private practice, I was lead counsel in the Guidant MDL up in Minnesota, had 4,000 cases, 5,000 cases. At that point, it was the largest product MDL outside of asbestos. And it was 2006, 2007. Then I go in-house to Boston Scientific and I get involved in the largest MDL, which is the pelvic mesh litigation, involved, tens and hundreds of thousands of cases. So back in a time when they thought this would be used rarely and not often, we're in a situation which there are about 530,000 cases, civil cases in all of the federal judiciary. About 330,000 of those, 62.5%, are caught up in MDLs. No one envisioned that. That's where the numbers are. So you've got over 60% of the federal docket essentially being handled by 2 to 3% of the judges because they're the MDL judges in charge of these mass tort MDLs. So that's kind of what's going on, and we're in a position now, and we'll talk about it, where the rules of old aren't working for today. And there's a major effort to try to reform MDL rules to make them certainly more beneficial to those of us who represent the defendants and often corporate America.
Anthony, if I could add something to that.
Of course.
From the viewpoint of a lawyer who's always been on the defense side in civil litigation, it applies to MDLs, but it's also a broader point. Because your question originally, I think, was, what has been going on the last couple of decades in terms of these large litigations. One additional aspect to this is forum shopping. Plaintiffs' attorneys realize that some courts are friendlier to these types of suits brought as mass actions or class actions than other courts. If you look at the American Tort Reform Foundation, every year they put out their list of the top 10 so-called judicial hellholes. California state courts are always on that list, and certain other courts around the country are perennials. You find a lot of these cases in certain courts that have the reputations, correctly or incorrectly, as being plaintiff friendly. Kind of a corollary to that is that a lot of these cases are filed in state courts rather than federal courts. Because of course, federal district courts all are subject to the rules of civil procedure, which they can supplement. But procedural rules among the states, while generally uniform, do vary. And the challenge for a defendant often is finding a basis for removing a case from state court to federal court. And one additional aspect to that is what we call personal jurisdiction. You know, federal courts have subject matter jurisdiction over cases involving federal questions, over cases that meet the diversity requirements. But there's also personal jurisdiction, whether a court can assert jurisdiction over particular plaintiffs. And this has been the subject of tremendous litigation that's made its way to the Supreme Court within the last 5 years. And generally, the Supreme Court has been tightening up on personal jurisdiction to make it more difficult for a court to entertain a suit where there are out-of-state plaintiffs who were not injured in the forum state. So those are just some additional aspects to the overall picture.
And Tim, as you mentioned, when you're kind of setting the groundwork here, and Larry really filled in a lot of the important gaps here and a lot of the context of this. You said this was a system that really no one envisioned growing to the rate it did. 50 years ago, it was created to address, ideally, maybe a small number of really special and unique cases, and you could consolidate these, and for pretrial matters to be handled in one court or before one judge to really help resolve these things faster. So what were some of the unforeseen consequences of this? You mentioned advertising, for instance, and this has really turned into a boutique industry for some plaintiffs' attorneys. But what were some of the other maybe unforeseen consequences of this when it comes to procedure, or even kind of results that were antithetical of the MDL's creation in the first place?
Yeah, so I think it's several things. I think one is when you have consolidated proceedings of this size, you end up with a lot of what I call junk cases. They have no merit. There have been estimates out there that 30 to 35% of cases caught up in mass tort MDLs lack merit. And there's probably a reason for that. They get kind of lost in the shadows. Plaintiffs' lawyers around the country file them in mass kind of master complaint. They just file it, don't need to provide any details. So you end up with a lot of junk cases. Number two, there's a disproportionate discovery going on in these big MDLs. You know, back in the old days, you know, plaintiff sued defendant would serve discovery, take a deposition, back and forth, back. That's not the way it is right now. Right now, a plaintiff can file a lawsuit, fill out often incompletely a fairly general fact sheet, and then just slip off into the benches. The first year and a half of litigation involving these cases involved discovery against the defendants. I mean, millions of documents produced, custodial depositions, company witness depositions. So the entire burden of discovery is disproportionately on the defendants. You also have a tendency of kind of the merits are not getting addressed. As discovery is going on, this thing's moving along. You want to file a motion. You clearly can't file a motion against the plaintiffs because you don't have enough information to go after them, and you're barred from doing that. It's hard to file a motion for summary judgment on the dispositive issue because you want to move through this costly, burdensome discovery process. So often the consideration of dispositive motions is delayed. And then worse than that is once they're addressed, there's no immediate right to get that reviewed. So if you go into, you go through a year of discovery, you go through a year of getting a motion for summary judgment up, ready and argued, it gets ruled. You think, okay, it's ruled after 2 years. Let's let an appellate court take a look at it. There's no right for a defendant to take an adverse ruling on the dispositive issue up to the appellate court when it's ruled. So when can you take it up? Well, that's the bellwether process. So while this is going on, you select individual plaintiffs, whose cases you want to try. The judge rules on dispositive motions, but doesn't let it go up on appeal unless they certify it under 1292B, which is almost unheard of in the MDL setting. So you end up with discovery, bellwether process, motion practice, a bellwether trial, a jury verdict, post-trial motions, resolution of those post-trial motions, finally an appeal, maybe 2 to 3 years after the MDL starts, a year to 2 at the appellate courts. You're sitting here not getting the dispositive matters resolved and seen by an appellate court until 3, 4, 5 years after it starts. So those are some of the issues, and underlying the one other issue I'll talk about, and we'll get to kind of what we're trying to do about these problems, is this push towards settlement. I mean, because it's a long process, I think MDL judges, at least some of them, think the most efficient and expeditious way to resolve an MDL is to get it settled, not try 3 bellwether cases and remand 80,000 cases to federal judges around the country. So there is a push, some more than others, to try to settle this litigation. They appoint settlement masters, they have settlement committees, they start making public comments about the importance of the defendant trying to settle this case or this litigation. And there's a lot of pressure on defendants to do that. And that's particularly dangerous because this is in the context of defendants really not getting any information about people on the other side of the fence and not having the merits of their potentially dispositive motions resolved in a timely fashion. So those, I think, are the problems with these mega tort MDLs. And at some point, we'll talk about kind of what we're trying to do about it.
And if I could just add, picking up on the bellwether point, I mean, I think I can't call it an unintended consequence because as we've heard, one of the purposes of the MDL is for a judge to rule on common questions of law or fact. But when you do have an MDL and there is a ruling on a key legal issue in a bellwether case, depending on how that comes out, that'll have tremendous consequences in every suit involved in the MDL. And one good current example of that is the current litigation involving Roundup herbicide. I'm sure you've all seen TV ads trolling for alleged victims of using Roundup herbicide, the active ingredient of which is glyphosate. One of the key legal issue in that case, and in many product liability cases involving not only pesticides, but drugs and medical devices, is failure to warn. The manufacturer failed to warn me, the plaintiffs alleged, that if I use this product, I would develop cancer or some other disease. And the legal issue is whether federally regulated products like drugs and medical devices, certain cosmetics and pesticides, whether those kinds of things are preempted by federal law. In the Roundup litigation, there's currently a petition for certiorari pending in the Supreme Court on the failure to warn issue and federal preemption. And the way that comes out will be tremendously important to, I don't know how many thousands of cases involved in the number of MDLs involving Roundup. When we get into the science issue, this case is also an important example because here's a situation where the federal agency, EPA, after years of reviewing scientific data, has said that there is no reliable scientific evidence that glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, causes cancer. And EPA went so far as to say if you put on the label, on your product label, that it causes cancer, that would be false and misleading, and you're violating federal law. But yet juries are holding the manufacturer liable for failing to put the very same warning on the label that the federal government says is false and misleading. And so whether that kind of claim is preempted in an MDL has tremendous potential consequences for both the defendant in the case, which happens to be Monsanto Company, or thousands of claimants.
And that transitions well to the next question I had, because you both brought up the idea that these mass tort cases, they often concern product liability issues. And so often you have this causation debate. Did the alleged product cause the harm that the plaintiff is alleging? And that often comes down to really complicated questions of science and expert testimonies. And I mentioned at the beginning, it's been discussed so far, but nearly 20 years ago, we had Daubert. And it talks about that judges have a gatekeeping role in admitting certain scientific evidence at trial. And Larry, this question was more for you to set more of the groundwork for this. What is actually Daubert and the Daubert trilogy telling us here? What does the Supreme Court instruct trial judges to do? And have trial judges been doing that? What have been some of the problems of perhaps inconsistent applications of Daubert among different courses and the consequences of that?
Well, Daubert itself was a case that, from a legal technical viewpoint, held that Federal Rule of Evidence 702 was applicable. So you can't think about Daubert without thinking of Rule 702, which is the rule on expert testimony. And basically what that rule says is that, as interpreted by Daubert and its progeny, is that to be admissible, expert testimony has to not only be relevant, but also reliable, whether it's scientific testimony or other types of expert testimony. What's happened in the real world is, at least from the defense viewpoint, is that a lot of judges, federal district court judges, because that's who Rule 702 governs, but also state court judges, because many states have adopted a form of Rule 702, are not fulfilling their gatekeeper function. And basically, what a lot of judges who aren't fulfilling that responsibility are doing is saying, well, this is really a question that goes to the weight of the evidence. So we're going to let the jury decide, what weight, if any, to give to the plaintiff's causation testimony. I, the judge, am not going to just, say that it's inadmissible up front. Let the jury decide. And the question is whether that represents a shirking of the gatekeeper role, failure to provide the Daubert analysis. And one very recent case is a good example. It was just decided last month. It's called Sardis versus Overhead Door Company by the Fourth Circuit. And it's kind of a primer on Rule 702. And basically, the Fourth Circuit has repudiated a district judge's failure to fulfill the gatekeeping role. Some very good language in that case about what the gatekeeping role is and what a judge's obligation is. So when you think about this, let's just posit a hypothetical where an expert is basing an opinion on unreliable scientific testimony. You can call it junk science, or you can just call it unreliable, or something in between. The question to think about is, if the judge says, let the jury decide what weight, if any, to give to that testimony, is it inherently unfair to a defendant to ask a jury, a lay jury, to weigh junk science? Is it always going to come out the wrong way if it's junk science? And if it does come out the wrong way, then does that represent a deprivation of due process? Does it result in a trial that's not fair for the defendant? On the other hand, if the judge fulfills the gatekeeper role and decides whether proffered expert testimony is reliable enough to go to the jury, you have a much reduced risk of depriving a party of due process, much less of a risk of a trial that is not fair. And just one last point on this. There's currently pending a proposed amendment to Rule 702, which is being considered by the administrative conference. And it is, I meant the administrative office of the courts, not the administrative conference. And basically the rule would amend, the amendment would change Rule 702 to clarify, to strengthen the role of judges, the need for judges to decide admissibility and not just under the rubric of weight of the evidence, throw the credibility, the reliability of the scientific testimony to the jury. So that's something to watch. There are comments are due next February, and probably a couple of years from now, the rule might be amended.
So Larry,
if I could just add to that a little bit. I mean, it's whether people like it or not, and plaintiffs' lawyers tend not to like it. The rule's been set up, and it was established by Daubert some many years ago, that the judge is the gatekeeper. Larry mentioned that. And there's a reason for that. It is, you just can't dump a bunch of science in front of a jury and say, is this really of value? Should it have been admitted or not? It's up to the judge to decide that as the gatekeeper. And that's what Daubert said. That's what Rule 702 says and has always said. It was reinforced in an amendment in the year 2000 that it was the job of the judge. To the point of the proposed change that's going on right now that Larry mentioned, there's the way, some of you may not know this, but the way rules are changed. There are lots of rules: appellate rules, bankruptcy rules, federal rules of civil procedure, evidence rules. All of that's under the auspices of a standing committee appointed by the Supreme Court, made up of judges. This proposed change is being considered by the evidence subcommittee. And what they've proposed is a rule change that says that it's up to the judge to determine by preponderance of the evidence, the burden of the authoring party by preponderance of the evidence to prove the helpfulness, reliability, the reliable application, and all of these elements of Rule 702, reinforcing the point that it's the judge's job. He can't or she cannot send it directly to the jury, and that's what the notes say. So yeah, a lot of comments are going to be made on it, but it just tend to kind of reinforce the point that the judge is the one who has to determine what evidence is reliable and relevant enough to come before the jury. That's not a revolutionary issue. It applies to scientific testimony, and judges need to apply that standard when it comes to determining and weighing whether a particular expert scientific testimony is helpful, reliable, etc.
And Tim,
why do you think that judges just don't do it? I mean, you've had a lot of stand-up experience, before all sorts of judges. Is it that they don't understand their responsibility, or they just don't want to fulfill it? What do you think the motivation is?
Yeah, I've tried a lot of cases as a client. I've seen a lot of cases. There's always, and mine have always been sort of in the scientific world, being prescription drugs, medical devices, chemical exposures, and things like that. I think some judges just say, I don't want to mess with it. What's the line between admissibility and weight? Clearly, when a scientific expert testifies, if it's admissible, appropriately admissible under Rule 702, there's still a responsibility of the jury to weigh, which expert to believe. So I think some judges have a hard time saying, where's the line? If this guy's a crook and a liar, the jury can figure that out. So I think sometimes it's just kind of a blurry line about, what's my job versus the jury job. I think some people just have a default that, I just think it's up to the jury to decide what experts to believe. I'm not going to get involved in sort of weighing the science, where things peer reviewed, is it tested, was the opinion developed outside of the litigation, all the Daubert standards, all the Rule 702 standards. I think they get overwhelmed by sort of the scientific complexity. And some of them just go, we'll just send it to the jury, let the jury decide. And if the party wants it to be inadmissible wins, it's a moot point. And then I can consider on post-trial, and eventually the appellate court can do it.
And in that regard, it's very important not to confuse the so-called battle of the experts, where each side puts on experts that have conflicting opinions, with the gatekeeper role on admissibility. There should only be a battle of the experts if the experts on both sides are testifying to reliable, whose testimony is reliable under the Daubert Rule 7 and Rule 702 standards. I think maybe some judges, conflate the two, as Tim just said, and you don't really get to the battle of the experts unless you've got testimony that satisfies the criteria of Rule 702 or its state counterpart.
And needless to say, and Tim, both of you are bringing this up about the complicated these issues are, how difficult it is for the rule when weighing these expert testimony, whether or not something for judges upholding their gatekeeping responsibility. Tim, you're mentioning one of the biggest issues with MDL tends to be an early push and rush to settlement. Do you think some of that is correlated with the hesitancy to really get to the later stages and start looking at this stuff more on the merits? Do you think there's a connection there?
Yeah, maybe. I think there are a lot of reasons why there's a push to settlement. I think, some judges just are inclined that way, whether it's a one-off case or, 10,000 cases in front of them. They just think, let's open some discussion about whether we can resolve this by settlement or not. I don't think it's because they're generally lazy and don't want to do the hard work. My experience with federal judges is they're hard workers and they're conscientious, and they really try to do a good job. But I think, the issue, we talked about the change on the proposed change Lori mentioned on Rule 702. There's been a real battle trying to change, the MDL rules as well. And this battle goes back, 3 years ago or so, 4 years ago. And it's before not the evidence committee, before the Civil Rules Advisory Committee. And, the Lawyers for Civil Justice, is a great organization involved in changing the rules of civil procedure, have a great track record. I'm biased, been a member a long time. I was president recently. But they proposed in 2017 some changes to the rules of civil procedure to make MDLs more fair. Here are the problems, here's what we can do to kind of fix them. We can require pleadings to be more particular, allow them to be more challenged. Require disclosure of third-party litigation funding, allow interlocutory appeals on some kinds of dispositive issues earlier rather than later. So we can talk a little bit, Anthony, about kind of where those things stand right now. But interestingly, on the subject of settlement that you raised, out of the blue, the Civil Rules Advisory Committee, particularly the subcommittee looking at these MDL changes, asked both plaintiffs and defendants involved in the process, should we change the process around how MDLs are settled? It was a bit of a surprise because no one had mentioned that there was a problem with that. I think these judges had heard maybe from MDL judges, other MDL judges, maybe heard from some plaintiffs' lawyers that were unhappy with settlements. But there's this issue now, whether there needs to be some changes about how MDL cases are settled, often by the lead lawyers, and then the settlement's reached and other people sort of opt in or opt out at the end of the day. But a lot of that, I think, is being, at least some of it's being driven by MDL judges because it kind of facilitates the role of trying to resolve these more quickly, more efficiently for themselves and the parties.
If we can just digress for a minute, to the class action side, because of course, a lot of product liability and other suits that involve scientific issues, toxic tort issues and so forth, come in the form of putative class actions. I mean, the conventional wisdom is that the certification of a class is kind of the death knell, is the phrase that a lot of courts use for the defendants, and is really the critical point where settlements occur if they don't occur even before there's a decision on certification of a class. So there's tremendous pressure to settle, and the Supreme Court has observed that in a number of cases. And there is a class action rule, Rule 23F of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, that it allows either the plaintiff or the defendant in a putative class action to ask the Federal Court of Appeals to review the certification decision, but it's up to the Court of Appeals whether they're going to hear that appeal. And I'd say probably with the exception of the Seventh Circuit, it's very difficult. It happens, but it's quite difficult to get a Court of Appeals to review a certification decision in the class action on an interlocutory basis. So that's another reason why a lot of these types of cases settle. I know we're talking about MDLs, but I thought that we should just say something about class actions to round out the picture here.
And Tim, do you kind of want to mention that more on the MDL side, this idea of interlocutory appeals, maybe a little more information about what interlocutory appeals are and maybe how they would help the MDL process, and maybe the ability to have an interlocutory appeal now, maybe some of those burdens and challenges, and maybe what some potential reforms might offer MDL litigation itself and for litigators who are currently doing MDL cases.
Yeah, Larry, that's a nice segue to that point. Thanks for the question. You know, this is a big issue where I think the defense bar and the corporate America are trying to get some changes. And I explained the problem with the delayed review by an appellate court. And the problem we have now is that appellate review is virtually entirely in the province of the MDL judge. The MDL judge can decide whether to certify a ruling as a final judgment or enough under 1292B or not. And we argued, in part of the proposal that LCJ proposed to the Civil Rules Advisory Committee, was allow interlocutory appeals of certain substantive, potentially dispositive motions, and don't allow the MDL judge to basically prevent it from happening by saying no. And that's what they can do under 1292B. That governs 1292B says that appellate, the court who decides it, the trial court, can decide whether to certify it, and then it's still an issue for the appellate court on whether to take it or not. So we wanted a proposal along the lines of what Larry talked about, the class action appeal, which is under 23F, which says that if the trial court denies or grants class certification, it can go up to the appellate court. Now, the appellate court can say, we don't want to take it, but the trial court judge cannot prevent it from being presented to the appellate court, which is the current situation. This generated a lot of discussion, as you can imagine. I mean, there are a lot of stakeholders in this whole thing. Plaintiffs' lawyers did not want it at all. The defense bar generally wanted it. MDL judges reportedly generally did not want it because it sort of interfered with kind of their handling of this. There were concerns raised about, well, if it goes up on appeal, what happens down at the trial court? Does the MDL stop for 2 years while the appellate court considers it? We said no, but that was a concern, is going to delay things. So there were even the appellate judges, some of them I think would favor looking at something like this, some perhaps not so favorably inclined to kind of go into before an actual final judgment's entered after a trial. So you had a lot of different people weighing into different things. And I think that, I can't speak for the Civil Rules Advisory Committee, I never would in a million years, but I think their thought was, this is a problem. It is something when you can't get an appellate review of the merits of a dispositive issue until 3-4 years after the MDL starts and after tens and hundreds of millions of dollars are spent. That's really not fair. But how do you handle the delay? How do you handle the, everything stops for a while, and how do you keep it going if there's an uncertain issue about there? What do you do about What do you do about these issues on how do you define what goes up essentially? That was a big issue. So if some go up and some go and don't go up in this fashion, how do you define it? And there's a lot of wordsmithing and discussion about that. Unfortunately, the Civil Rules Advisory Committee has said for now, they're just not going to entertain a rule change that allows interlocutory appeals in MDL cases. I think I never say no. I think we can continue to sort of bang that drum a little bit. I think it's a critical issue, becoming more critical by the year as these MDLs continue to dominate more. And we get examples of, an MDL like 5 years after it starts, where finally the appellate court says, it shouldn't have gone beyond, the zero square. A little late for that after a lot of settlements and trials. So it's there now. I think it's one we'll continue to sort of press the button on, but it is a critical issue. And if we had something like 23F kind of adapted to the MDL situation, I think would be beneficial for the overall process.
So, I mean, one way to look at this in a broad way is it kind of pits, what Kim was describing, kind of pits due process against judicial efficiency and the cost savings to plaintiffs and defendants that are supposed to be achieved through MDLs. But does due process, require an earlier resolution of these key dispositive legal issues? I think that most people on the defense side would say yes.
And so for the last 15 minutes or so, I want to take some audience questions. It's easier for people who are interested in submitting questions to use the Q&A button at the bottom. Sometimes some of the comments do get lost in the chat, but I did spot a couple that I wanted to ask. And one of them concerns the idea of assisting judges considering these difficult science questions when it gets to considering Rule 702, their gatekeeping function. One of the ideas and one of the popular reforms that has been suggested is the idea of perhaps having independent advisors. So the sense of maybe having what's been called science days for MDL cases, or having an independent science panel assist and help judges in resolving or considering and really educating judges on many of these questions. Of course, judges are coming to this without the same background as obviously the experts, the industry leaders, or even the attorneys who are litigating these cases. So I'm curious what your thoughts on the idea of either a science panel or outside independent advisors somehow educating the court and helping them consider these issues and perhaps resolving these cases better and not falling into some of this weight versus admissibility traps that we've often seen.
A huge can, if I can go first, a huge can of worms from a due process viewpoint. Who are these advisors going to be? Are they going to be advising judges in secret, or with the parties present? Are they going to be subject to cross-examination? And if you have all those bells and whistles, why shouldn't they just be expert witnesses? And there's plenty of bias in academia among scientists. Well, not only in academia, but scientists who work for corporations, scientists who work for the government. So I just think it's totally unworkable and a huge problem from a due process viewpoint.
Yeah, I would break it up into two issues. I agree with Larry, but there are two science things I kind of want to talk about. You mentioned Science Day and all of that. I think that it's important to break it up into two categories. I'm a big fan of educating the MDL judge on the science. I mean, having a Science Day, maybe having your witnesses come in and talk to the judge about the science, so the judge really gets a firm understanding of the issues. I think that's critically important. I favor that. Open setting, you may be one side or the other, whatever you want to do. There are different ways to do it. There's almost no bad way to do it. I think the best way is to do it in open, let everybody see everything. So I think that's a science presentation. I think that's important because it allows the judge to exercise his 702 gatekeeping role in an informed way. You can tell by my hair, I've been around a long time, and I remember the breast implant litigation. And I tried several breast implant cases around the country back in the day. There was an MDL involving breast implants and those cases. And Judge Pointer was the MDL judge. So he appointed a scientific panel of, quote, independent experts to sort of gather information, discuss the science, and come up with sort of their reports on whether there's a scientific basis for this claim versus that claim and all of that. I'm not a fan of that. I think that's just cumbersome. Who do you pick? How long does it take? I think it's sort of the MDL judge kind of passing his or her responsibility off to somebody else. I don't favor that kind of science panel at all. But the parties educating the judge on science, to me, the more the merrier.
And let's in the final 10, 12 minutes that we have, let's kind of talk about the future and the way policymakers can actually help with this. So I suppose we'll start with the doom and gloom, and then we'll finish with the more optimistic viewpoint and perspectives and maybe things that can be accomplished. But with the increase of these types of cases, I think both of you did a really great job summarizing them, kind of the real world pragmatic implications of these. Let's say there are no rule changes. Things are kind of as they go on. The MDL process and how it was designed and created 50 years ago is the same with no statutory change. What are the implications of that for federal courts, for the MDL process specifically? And then maybe, Larry, you can fill out some of the implications for state courts, whether it comes to the business of law, whether it comes to the judicial resources or maybe straining judicial resources. What are some of the real world issues that we should be thinking or be worried about if we're going along this path of an increase of these types of cases and the way they're structured and ultimately resolved?
Yeah, I could start from the MDL side of things. I think from the federal judiciary standpoint, I think to the extent you run with 60, 70%, and this is escalating tremendously. I mean, the number of cases are just growing year after year, and the percentage of the federal civil docket growing by year caught up in the MDL and fewer judges. I just think from the standpoint of sort of being able to serve the role and to give honor to Rule 1, which is these rules exist for just, fair, and efficient and cost-effective resolution. I think it does tremendous damage to that thing, to that principle. People ask me. I've testified for the Rules Advisory Committee more than once. I met with members. I've submitted. I've done all of these things. And so the question is, well, if you're the defendant, which I was for many years in the public mesh litigation, what difference does it make to you if there are, lots of cases out there and it's going to take a while to resolve them? And people don't understand kind of what it's like to be, an executive in a public company that faces a lot of litigation. And you start getting, analyst questions. It puts a cloud over the sky. It affects lots of things that really don't deal with the commercial success of that company. You just have to deal with a lot of disruption. You've got individual employees their job description isn't to give depositions. They have to give 20 of them. They go into trial. They're looking at documents. There's a tremendous amount of disruption, a tremendous amount of cost being wasted in the process. And I think most importantly, we ought to really kind of go back to this, Anthony, which is the basic principle of what our system of justice ought to be. And that is to take cases, evaluate the merits of those cases, and decide where those merits land on, and either try it, resolve it in front of a jury, or settle it in the context of kind of what about how the court's going to view the merits of the case. That's what we do. And anything that tends to sort of bastardize that process, when you have meritless cases that everybody knows and they're not doing anything about it, the force to settle them before the merits are really resolved. These are not, in my view, an example of an efficient system of justice. And I think we ought to be driven by that principle as much as sort of just the needs of corporate America. I think we ought to be faithful to what we created, back in the 1930s when the rules of civil procedure were first drafted and approved.
And Larry, I was curious if you had any comments about maybe the implications of more state courts or some of the other aspects of this.
Well, I think much of the same is applicable to state courts. I think it's important for state courts not to exceed their, the personal jurisdiction that they have over parties in litigation. I think it's important to ensure that federal courts are taking a serious look at cases that are removed. There was a Supreme Court case earlier this year about the appellate jurisdiction of federal courts of appeals when cases are remanded and then they are appealed. Generally, you can't appeal a remand order after a case is removed, except if it's a federal officer removal or a civil rights issue. But once it is appealed, the Supreme Court says that they can look at all the grounds for removal. That came up in the climate change context, but it's an important principle. But aside from state courts, I think there's another big area for policymakers to think about, if I can just posit that. And to me, it kind of goes to the intersection between regulation and litigation. I alluded to it earlier, but I don't have an answer. It's just kind of the question I want to raise, which is, you know, when you have a federally regulated product where the federal regulation is based on expert federal agencies scrutinizing scientific data about the safety of a product. And when the federal agency, whether it's the FDA or EPA or Consumer Product Safety Commission or others, you know, has a view about the safety of a product, should a jury, whether it's in the state court or a federal court, be entitled to second guess that determination and decide that, well, that might be fine for federal regulatory purposes or even state regulatory purposes, because some big states like California have similar agencies, but can we award damages anyway because we, the jury, think the product's defective or the defendant didn't provide adequate warnings about the risks that we heard the experts say exist, even though those experts disagree with the regulators. So this whole question about the relationship between federal regulatory determinations based on science and litigation that implicates science is something for federal and state policymakers and others to think about.
In going along with that, I think often, and Larry, you're bringing up the importance of policymakers to scrutinize and consider these ideas more often than they really do. I think often you see, well, federal courts are doing their own thing, state courts are doing their own thing, and really there's tremendous room and opportunity for legislators and for policymakers to be a part of the process and really be a little more active than they have been in the past. And so I guess we'll finish with these two different questions. For both of you, if you were to think of maybe one change, whether a massive structurally changing change or something really small, minute, what would you recommend to policymakers if they're asking you, what is one thing you should really investigate or think of, whether it's ambitious or very, very small, that would really help improve the current cases and the outlook that we're seeing? Tim, importantly, you're saying, getting back to these principles of taking these cases, evaluating these cases on the merits and focusing on that priority. What would be the biggest change you would suggest? I know we talked about a number of them, but would potentially be the most impactful or the most immediate?
Yeah, go ahead, Larry. Go ahead, Larry.
I think Tim has already explained it very well. Interlocutory appeals, I think, would be a huge improvement.
Yeah, the one I would add to that, I agree with that. I'd put an interlocutory appeal probably number one, but maybe number two, because I think wrestling with this idea of just this, what I call coattail litigation, these people around the country advertising, getting cases, and they don't investigate the merits of the cases or the facts, and they just kind of throw them into master complaint, and then they sit back and wait. I think that's one of the most disturbing things to me, this idea that people are filing cases that have no merit. Maybe they know that they have no merit, or they don't care whether they have merit or not because they're not going to get exposed. So the change I would propose, and we tried to get this through, LCJ did through the Civil Rules Advisory Committee. If you're going to file a case in an MDL, you have to provide some substantiating evidence for your case. Not an expert report or anything like that. You got to prove that you were exposed to the product. You got to prove that that product caused some demonstrable injury. And, someone has to certify to that. So you create not a huge barrier for entry, but at least a barrier that requires judges, plaintiff's lawyers to do an investigation, put the plaintiff on notice that you've got to tell the truth on this. And I think that will sort of whittle down the sort of number of, whittle down the number of cases out there and really allow us to say, okay, we got X cases that have some certified basis of believing they have some merit. They may not at the end of the day. But I think the problem we have now is MDLs that should have 5,000, 10,000 claimants who have legitimately have claims of exposure and damage, liability aside, those become not 5,000 to 10,000 MDLs, they become 10, 20, 30, 50,000 case MDLs because it gets caught up in a lot of cases that don't have merit and substantiation. And it's the number that makes it hard for MDL judges to manage and defendants to manage. So I'd really like to have some rule, not a lone pine order, not that detail, but something that requires some substantiation so we can kind of, as I said, whittle down the number of cases that lack merit.
And thank you for offering those I think it'd be incredibly important and helpful changes. And with just a couple of minutes left, if there's anything you want to fill in the gaps, anything we have potentially left or haven't considered, or something you want to leave for our audience before we conclude for the day.
Yeah, what I would say is get involved. I think lawyers, particularly people in private practice, as I was for a good number of years, the job is to get cases, win cases, and be involved in the trenches. But I do think there's kind of a higher calling for lawyers, and that is to sort of lead the profession better and the system of justice better than it is when we came into it. So I like this idea of getting involved in change and reform and all of that. So I just urge everybody here, to get involved. We may not have all the answers, but get involved because I think it's more fulfilling to do this. I urge you to take a look at, what LCJ is doing, what ILR, the part of the chamber, is doing. Just take a look at that and get involved and make changes. It's kind of cool to testify in front of a bunch of judges at the Civil Rules Advisory Committee or the Rules of Evidence Committee. I just think it's a nice, rewarding thing. If we're going to get change, it's going to require a number of law firms, a number of in-house lawyers to get involved and sort of bang the drum, shine a light on this, and policy organizations like this great one sort of saying, here's a problem, let's talk about it, because then it becomes more real and we'll start looking for better solutions.
And in that regard, I'll just plug the group I work with, Atlantic Legal Foundation, because that's exactly what we do. We get involved. We file amicus curiae, friend of the court briefs in federal and state court appeals, mostly in the Supreme Court, but sometimes in the federal courts of appeals or state Supreme Courts when they involve important civil justice issues like the ones we've been talking about during the past hour. And this particular organization, Atlantic Legal, has an emphasis on good science in the courtroom. And we look for cases like that. So if anyone listening to this panel sees a case like that, please let us know.
All right, well, with that, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. We greatly appreciate it. For those viewing, we have concluded our event. I want to thank both Tim Pratt and Larry Ebner for joining me on this panel, and for the panelists who joined us earlier today to offer expertise and insight on these really difficult and nuanced issues. I also want to thank Congressman Peter Meyer for his opening remarks, and all of you who have joined us today. and submitted questions. We greatly appreciate your participation and your interest in this event. To note, you can find all of our work, including a later recording of this event, at rstreet.org, and feel free to follow us on Twitter and other social media platforms for news about future topics and events. With that, thank you all. Thank you again. Please take care, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.